The first thing she remembered was the smell. Not the stench of diesel or gunpowder that had haunted every mile of retreat across a collapsing Germany, but the smell of bacon. Thick, heavy, impossible bacon. The train doors slid open under the Kansas sun. Dozens of women stepped down in silence, their boots still caked with the mud of Europe. They had been told that American camps were built to humiliate, to break them, to prove their inferiority. They braced for cruelty. But what they found looked wrong. Barbed wire, yes. Guard towers, yes. Yet the guards were boys, smiling, relaxed, holding tin cups of coffee. Beyond the gate, someone was whistling. The air carried the sound of clinking plates. And that smell again. Bacon and eggs frying somewhere nearby. One woman, Leisel, glanced at her friend and whispered, "This must be a trick. They want us to let our guard down." But the guards just nodded politely and pointed toward a mess hall. Inside, sunlight spilled across rows of long tables. On every plate, white bread, real butter, scrambled eggs. No propaganda could have prepared them for this. She hesitated before sitting. Back home, even civilians were surviving on potato peels. Her brother had died in a snow trench outside Minsk for the Reich, and here, these same Americans were serving breakfast fit for officers to prisoners. As she lifted the fork, she looked around for hidden cameras, for jeering faces waiting to laugh. None came. Only the clatter of cutlery and the low hum of an American radio in the corner playing something slow and hopeful. That first bite, warm, rich, unreal, tasted like betrayal, not of her country, but of everything she had been taught about the enemy. Outside, the flag fluttered lazily in the wind, and she realized with a quiet dread that the war she thought she understood was about to change forever. But that was just the beginning. When the morning roll call ended, they were handed clean towels and told they could shower. Not cold water from a rusty pipe, but real, steaming hot water. Leisel hesitated at the doorway, clutching the towel against her chest. The word shower carried weight. Every rumor that had spread through the Reich about American camps twisted inside her mind. Gas chambers, experiments, retribution. She expected guards with rifles to bark orders, dogs to snap. Instead, a young American sergeant pointed toward a tiled room and said almost shyly, "Take your time, ma'am." Inside, steam clouded the air. Rows of porcelain stalls gleamed under fluorescent light. There was soap, actual soap, with a faint scent of lavender. One woman began to cry quietly as she scrubbed her hands, her face, her hair. Another laughed uncontrollably, splashing water on her friends like a child who'd forgotten how joy felt. They didn't understand it. This wasn't supposed to happen. Prisoners were supposed to be punished, not cared for. Leisel caught her reflection in the mirror. A gaunt face, eyes hollow but alive. For the first time in years, she didn't look like a soldier's widow or a prisoner. She just looked human. Later that afternoon, they were given uniforms, light khaki dresses, soft cotton, freshly laundered. A tag stitched on the inside read, U.S. Army property. The irony wasn't lost on them. Even captivity here came with craftsmanship. When dinner came, beef stew, bread rolls, coffee, they noticed something else. The guards ate the same food. No rations, no separation, no shouting. Just men and women on opposite sides of a wire, pretending not to notice how strange it all was. That night, lying on clean bunks, the women whispered into the dark. "Maybe they want to convert us. Maybe this is all for show." But no one could explain the simple truth. For the first time since the war began, they felt safe. And yet, beneath that uneasy peace, another question began to stir. If this was how the Americans treated their prisoners, what else had they been wrong about? The next morning began with a sound they hadn't heard in years. Music. Not the martial drums of parades, not the cold precision of military marches, but something softer, foreign, alive. It drifted across the compound from a wooden barrack where an American radio crackled to life. Bing Crosby's voice. "Don't fence me in!" The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A song about freedom inside a prison. Leisel stood by the fence, watching a line of POWs carrying crates of vegetables toward the kitchen. There were no rifles pointed at them, no shouts. One guard, a boy who couldn't have been older than 19, waved and offered her a cigarette through the wire. She shook her head at first, then hesitated, took it, and whispered, "Danke." He smiled. "You speak English?" She didn't answer, but something shifted. For a moment, the war didn't exist. Later, during work assignments, she saw the bakery. American flour, American ovens, American abundance, trays of white bread rolling out by the dozens, soft, warm, golden. In Germany, white bread had become a memory. They called it Kriegsbrot, war bread, dark, heavy, made with sawdust and sorrow. Yet here, the prisoners were served loaves that looked like home before Hitler. When the first batch came out, one of the women cried, not from hunger, but from the ache of remembering how things once were, before everything was swallowed by the party, before truth became a weapon. That evening, Leisel wrote her first note since capture. She didn't have paper, so she tore a scrap from the inside of a Red Cross pamphlet. "We were told Americans were monsters, but they feed us like family. Maybe they have won not because of power, but because of plenty." She hid the note inside her pillow. Outside, floodlights lit the camp in a steady, gentle glow. No shadows, no fear. Just the strange, uncomfortable realization that the enemy had given her more humanity than her own leaders ever had. But that wasn't the most shocking thing they would see that week. 3 days later, the routine had begun to feel almost normal. The shock had dulled into confusion. Every morning began with the same ritual: a whistle, the clatter of tin cups, the smell of bacon and coffee that somehow still felt like an insult to everything they had endured back home. But on the 4th day, a truck pulled into camp, and everything changed again. From its open bed, men began unloading boxes marked "Books, U.S. Library Service." Books? For prisoners? The women gathered in disbelief as soldiers carried them into a wooden hut newly painted white. Inside, shelves had already been built. Within an hour, there stood what could only be described as a library. Leisel walked in slowly, trailing her fingers over the spines. Hemingway, Dickens, Twain. On one table sat a typewriter, next to it a stack of blank paper and pencils. The sign above the door read, "Education Hut. Voluntary." She stared at that word, voluntary. Back home, everything had been commanded. You didn't choose what to read, what to think, what to believe, but here they were invited to think for themselves. An American chaplain explained through an interpreter that they could write letters, learn English, even take classes if they wished. One woman laughed bitterly. "Are we prisoners or students?" The chaplain smiled softly. "Maybe both." That night, by the dim light of a single bulb, Leisel practiced her first English words. Thank you. Bread. Peace. She didn't know why she was doing it. Maybe out of curiosity, maybe defiance. Or maybe because something deep inside her had begun to crumble. Outside, the guards smoked and told jokes they could not understand. The same guards who had fought against their fathers and brothers now lent them pencils. For the first time, Leisel wondered if true power wasn't in the gun or the flag, but in the freedom to choose what you think when no one is watching. They thought they had seen everything. But America still had one more surprise waiting. One that would shatter the last thing they believed about mercy and war. It happened on a Sunday morning. The guards called for volunteers. They said the kitchen needed help, and anyone willing could earn extra rations. Half a dozen women raised their hands, more out of curiosity than hunger. When they stepped inside the mess hall, the air was thick with the smell of butter and sugar. On the counter sat rows of silver containers filled with milk, flour, chocolate, and in the middle of it all, a tall humming machine that froze and churned at the same time. Leisel watched as an American cook, freckles across his nose, poured the mixture into the machine and smiled. "Ever had ice cream?" he asked. The women looked at each other. None of them answered. In wartime Germany, ice cream had disappeared years ago. Even the word felt like a ghost from another life. Childhood summers, festivals, laughter. Minutes later, he handed each of them a paper cup. Cold, sweet, unbelievable. Leisel took a spoonful and felt the chill spread through her tongue, through her chest, through something deeper. Around her, others began to laugh softly, the sound trembling with disbelief. One woman whispered, "This can't be real. We are prisoners." The cook shrugged. Not today. Afterward, they were invited to carry the same dessert out to the guards. No one shouted at them to hurry. No one searched them for hidden weapons. One guard even tipped his cap. "Thank you, ladies." That night, as the camp quieted under the Kansas sky, Leisel sat outside her barrack and looked up. The Milky Way stretched above her like frost on black glass. She thought about her brother dying in the snow, about the boys who never came home, about a world where kindness from an enemy could hurt more than cruelty. She whispered into the wind, half in English, half in German, "If this is defeat, why does it feel like forgiveness?" But deep down she knew. What she had just witnessed wasn't forgiveness. It was something far more dangerous, understanding. And the next day, that understanding would be tested in ways none of them could imagine. The storm arrived in the form of silence. That morning, the guards didn't whistle. No radios played. The camp, usually alive with distant laughter and the scrape of dishes, was still. A rumor slipped through the barracks like smoke. "A transport is coming." The women lined up by the fence, the air thick with dread. They expected punishment, a transfer, maybe a return to Europe. Instead, they saw trucks filled with crates, stamped U.S. Army Medical Corps. Doctors climbed down, white coats fluttering in the wind. Behind them rolled metal trolleys with supplies. Gauze, penicillin, stethoscopes. The interpreter's voice echoed, "They need volunteers to assist with local civilians. Children, mostly." Civilians? Children? The women stared in disbelief. They were prisoners, yet the Americans were asking for help. Within an hour, Leisel found herself inside a nearby field hospital. Rows of American nurses bent over children with whooping cough, malnutrition, burns. Not soldiers, farm kids from small Kansas towns, and for the first time the German women saw suffering that wasn't their own. She held a boy's hand while a medic changed his bandages. The child winced, then whispered, "Danke." He didn't even know what the word meant. He'd just heard it from her. That single syllable undid something inside her chest. Later, one of the nurses handed her a vial. "Penicillin," she said, "for infection. A miracle, they call it." Leisel blinked. In Germany, that same medicine was reserved for high officers and scientists. Here, it was given to children and to prisoners. That night, back in camp, she couldn't sleep. Around her, others lay awake too, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with thoughts they could no longer silence. Maybe victory wasn't about tanks or bombers. Maybe it was about how a nation chose to treat even its enemies. And when a letter arrived weeks later, from Germany, sealed and trembling in her hands, it would reveal just how deep that difference ran, because what waited inside that envelope would break her heart all over again. The letter arrived folded twice, thin as if afraid of being opened. It bore the red stamp of the International Red Cross, its ink smeared by the long Atlantic crossing. Leisel's hands trembled as she recognized her mother's handwriting. Shaky, hurried, desperate. She sat alone on the edge of her bunk while the others slept, the faint hum of the generator outside the only sound. The first line hit like a blow. "Your brother did not die a hero. He was executed for refusing to shoot civilians." Her breath caught. The paper slipped from her fingers. For months, she had carried the image of him dying bravely for the fatherland, a soldier loyal to the end. Now that illusion collapsed in an instant, executed by their own army, for mercy. The letter continued, each word heavier than the last. Her mother wrote of bombed cities, burned homes, hunger, and silence. Neighbors vanished in the night. The party no longer promised victory. It demanded obedience. "They said you were captured," the letter ended. "But maybe that means you are the lucky one." Tears blurred the ink. Across the barrack, someone murmured in her sleep, "Guten Nacht." But Leisel didn't sleep. She walked outside, barefoot, the ground cold beneath her feet. The camp lights cast long white lines across the gravel. On the watchtower, an American soldier nodded politely. She looked up at him, not as a prisoner, not as an enemy, but as a woman stripped of everything she thought was true. Her brother had chosen compassion and died for it. The Americans, her captors, lived by it. The world she'd been raised to believe in was gone. What remained was unbearable clarity. She pressed the letter against her chest and whispered into the night, "Maybe defeat is not what I thought it was." And just as she thought she had reached the end of her disbelief, the Americans would show her one more thing, something that would turn even her grief into awe, because freedom, she would soon learn, had a sound. It started with a hum, low at first, almost mistaken for the wind. Then it grew, a chorus of voices drifting through the camp from the loudspeakers that usually barked orders. But this time, the voice was calm, rhythmic, full of warmth. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." The words rolled out like waves against the wire. The guards stood still. The prisoners froze. An interpreter whispered, "It's the 4th of July, Independence Day." The Americans were broadcasting the Declaration of Independence. Leisel sat on the steps of her barrack, eyes fixed on the tower where the voice echoed. Around her, women stared in silence. No drums, no marching boots, no shouting. Just those words: freedom, equality, liberty. Words that had been forbidden, twisted, and weaponized in their world. And then came the music. Brass, strings, drums, the U.S. Army band playing a tune that soared above the camp's fences. The guards laughed, saluted each other. Some danced with nurses by the kitchen, spinning to Glenn Miller's "In the Mood." One of the prisoners began to tap her foot. Another hummed softly. Before long, someone laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, almost painful in its honesty. For a moment, the fences disappeared. The barbed wire melted into sunlight, and Leisel realized something terrifying. Freedom didn't need permission. It could exist even here, inside a prison. That night, she wrote in her journal, "They fight with music, not fear. Their power is not in guns, but in belief." When the radio went silent, the night felt different, bigger, alive. But deep down, she knew that understanding freedom was one thing. Seeing what it demanded of her would be another. And soon, the Americans would ask them to make a choice that no prisoner had ever been given before. The announcement came just after sunrise. The American officer stood in the courtyard, clipboard in hand, his voice steady over the hush of the assembled prisoners. "Volunteers wanted," he said. "Non-combat work, farmland, construction, hospitals, you'll be paid. You'll eat the same as our workers. You can refuse, no punishment." For a long moment, no one moved. The word volunteer sounded unreal, almost dangerous. Back home, refusing an order meant prison. Here, refusing carried no consequence. Choice itself felt like a trap. Leisel glanced at her friends. Some looked away. Others stared at the ground, fists clenched. The questions rippled through them all the same. If they worked, were they betraying their country? If they refused, were they clinging to a lie? The officer waited patiently. "Think it over," he said. "No rush." Then he left the clipboard on the table and walked away. That evening, as the sun fell over the plains, the debate began. One woman spat, "They're testing us. They want to see who will crawl." Another whispered, "Maybe they're giving us a chance." When Leisel's turn came, she didn't argue. She just said quietly, "If helping them means feeding people instead of killing them, then maybe that's the first right thing I've done in years." The next morning, she signed her name. So did a dozen others. The guards shook their hands, real handshakes. No guards, no guns. They were driven out beyond the wire to a nearby farm where wheat shimmered gold under the July sky. As she worked, the farmer's wife brought them lemonade. The taste of it, sweet, cold, tangy, cut through everything she thought she knew about enemies. That night, lying in her bunk, Leisel stared at her calloused palms and thought, maybe captivity wasn't always made of fences. Sometimes it lived inside you. But freedom, she was beginning to realize, came with a price too. Because soon, one act of mercy would blur every line she thought still existed between guilt and grace. It was a scorching afternoon when the truck broke down outside the camp. The driver, a young American private, was thrown clear, his leg bleeding badly from shrapnel after a tire exploded on a sharp piece of metal. The guards shouted for the medic, but the camp doctor was away at the nearby town. Without thinking, Leisel pushed through the crowd. "He's bleeding out!" she cried in broken English. The guards hesitated, unsure what to do. She knelt beside the soldier, tore her sleeve, and pressed it against the wound. "Pressure," she said, her voice shaking but steady. "We must stop it." For a few seconds, no one moved. Then one of the guards, realizing what she was doing, rushed to help. Together they worked silently until the bleeding slowed. The young American's lips trembled. "You're German?" he gasped. She nodded. "Human," she answered. When the medic arrived, the officer ordered her back behind the wire. But that moment, her hands red with an enemy's blood, refused to fade. Word spread through the camp by evening. A German prisoner saved an American soldier. Some prisoners praised her courage, others hissed betrayal. "You helped them," one woman spat. "They bombed our cities." Leisel stared back, exhausted. "And we bombed theirs." That night, she sat alone by the fence. The wind was warm, carrying the scent of wheat and motor oil. She looked at her stained hands and whispered to herself, "Maybe mercy isn't something you deserve. Maybe it's something you choose." In the guard tower, someone began to hum the same tune from the 4th of July broadcast. Soft, steady, human. Leisel closed her eyes. For the first time, she didn't feel like a prisoner or even a survivor. She felt like part of something larger, something neither side had words for. But mercy, she would soon learn, had consequences, because what happened next would remind her that war never ends just because the guns go silent. The mail used to arrive every Thursday. Thin envelopes, trembling ink, fragments of a world collapsing but still alive. Then one week, nothing, and the next, nothing again. The Red Cross officer said only, "The lines to Germany are gone." Gone, like the cities, like the voices, like the war itself. For days, the women lingered by the fence after roll call, scanning the horizon for the familiar truck. It never came. The camp grew quieter, conversations shortened, even the radio stayed silent longer between songs. Leisel waited longer than most. She still believed her mother would write again. Until a guard approached one evening, his hat in his hands. "Miss, I'm sorry," he said gently. "Berlin's gone dark. No mails coming through. Not anymore." That night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams. The air felt heavy, still. The war, it seemed, was ending everywhere except inside her. She realized she no longer knew what home meant. The Germany she loved, the cobbled streets, the bakeries, the laughter, had vanished long before the bombs fell. What remained was only the echo of orders, slogans, and lies. The next morning she walked outside before sunrise. A mist hung over the fields. She listened, and for the first time there was no gunfire, no planes, no alarms, just birds, singing. It was the sound of peace, and it terrified her, because peace meant there was no longer an excuse, no enemy to blame, only memory and guilt. When the sun broke through the fog, she whispered, "So this is how wars really end, not with noise, but with silence." In that silence, she began to understand what defeat truly was, not loss of territory, not surrender, but the moment you see clearly what your own side has done and realize you can never unsee it. And yet, even that painful clarity was only the beginning, because soon the gates would open, and the world beyond them would force Leisel to decide who she truly was. It happened quietly, almost too quietly for history. No sirens, no salutes, no speeches. Just a jeep rolling into camp with 2 words painted on its hood, "War over." The guards didn't cheer. They simply stood at attention while an officer read from a paper, his voice thin against the wind. "The German High Command has surrendered unconditionally. All hostilities are to cease." For a moment, no one breathed. Then, as if on cue, the sound began. Gasps, sobs, nervous laughter. The women clutched one another, uncertain whether to celebrate or grieve. Leisel stood near the fence, staring at the open gate. The same gate that had confined her for months now stood wide, unguarded. Beyond it, the horizon stretched flat and endless. She should have felt joy, but instead, a strange emptiness filled her chest. Freedom, it turned out, was terrifying. An American sergeant approached with a clipboard. "You're free to go," he said softly. "Trains will take you east, or you can stay until transport is ready." Leisel nodded, but didn't move. "Go where?" she whispered. The man didn't answer. Maybe he didn't know either. That evening, she packed her few belongings, a scarf, a notebook, a torn letter, and sat on her bunk one last time. Around her, the barracks were half empty, voices echoing through bare wood and fading footsteps. Some women wept, others sat in silence, staring at nothing. When the sun dipped below the horizon, she stepped outside. The air smelled of rain and dust. The American flag still hung over the mess hall, fluttering softly in the twilight. She turned back toward the open gate. For months it had been the line between captivity and hope. Now it was the line between certainty and the unknown. As she crossed it, she felt her heart stumble. No guards stopped her. No guns followed her. Only the wind carried her forward, whispering through the wheat fields like an old prayer. She didn't look back. But she knew that part of her would never leave that camp, the part that had learned compassion from her captors and silence from her freedom. And in the days to come, that silence would speak louder than any victory parade. The train rolled through what used to be cities, but there were no rooftops anymore, only ribs of buildings jutting out like bones beneath ash. Windows gaped like hollow eyes. The sky itself seemed burned. Leisel stepped down at the Berlin station, or what was left of it. The tracks ended in rubble. A single sign, half charred, still read, "Willkommen." It felt like a cruel joke. People wandered through the ruins with buckets, searching for water, food, faces they might still recognize. The air smelled of smoke and iron, as if the city hadn't exhaled since the bombs stopped falling. She found her old neighborhood by memory more than sight. The bakery was gone. The church was a shell. Her mother's house, just a crater filled with rainwater and silence. No letters, no survivors. An old man sat nearby feeding crumbs to pigeons. She asked if he remembered the Muellers. He nodded slowly. They didn't leave when the fire came, he said. No one had anywhere left to go. That night, she slept in the ruins of what had been her childhood home. There was no roof, but the moonlight poured through the cracks like mercy. She read through her old notebook by candlelight, her brother's name, her mother's handwriting, her memories of the camp. For the first time, she understood that the Americans hadn't defeated Germany. The war had defeated them all. She whispered into the night, "We built monuments to power, and they turned to dust. They built kitchens, libraries, songs, and they're still alive." In the silence that followed, she didn't cry. She just listened. To the wind, to the distant footsteps of people starting over, to the heartbeat of a city that refused to die. Because from the ashes, something else was beginning. Something quieter, stronger, more human. And soon, that something would find its way to her too, carried by a face she never expected to see again. She first saw him standing by the ruins of the old train depot, an American Jeep idling behind him, its engine purring like something from another world. His uniform was clean, his boots new, but his face, she remembered, Private James Carter, the boy she had held down on the gravel months before, blood soaking through her hands. He saw her at the same time. For a moment, neither moved. Then he smiled, hesitant, but real. "I thought you were dead," he said. "So did I," she replied. He told her he'd been sent with a reconstruction team, engineers, medics, translators, to help the German civilians rebuild what was left. The Americans were giving out food and medicine to anyone who came forward. It sounded like a fairy tale spoken in a graveyard. She guided him through the ruins of her street. He said little, just looked around quietly at the broken stones and scorched walls. "I've seen cities bombed before," he murmured, "but not like this." When they reached the crater that had been her home, she stopped. "This was it," she said simply. He nodded, then placed something on the ground, a small paper-wrapped parcel. Inside were canned peaches, soap, and a folded piece of cloth, an American flag patch. "Not for politics," he said softly. "For memory. You saved me once. I figured I owed you something that lasts longer than gratitude." For a long time, neither spoke. Around them, the ruins were silent except for the soft creak of a door swinging in the wind. Finally, she said, "In the camp, I thought mercy was weakness." He smiled faintly. "And I thought forgiveness was impossible." They stood there, two survivors from opposite sides of a vanished world. No flags, no uniforms, just people. Before leaving, he looked back once and said, "The world will rebuild, Leisel. Just don't let it forget." She watched the Jeep disappear into the gray horizon. In her hands, the cloth fluttered lightly in the wind, not as a symbol of victory, but of memory. And for the first time, she began to wonder whether the true enemy had ever been each other, or the lies that made them believe they were. Berlin, autumn 1946. The air still carried the scent of dust and diesel, but life had begun to crawl back through the cracks. Amid the rubble stood a small building patched together from scavenged bricks and tarps. Above its doorway hung a hand-painted sign, Kinderheim, Children's Home. Leisel volunteered there after hearing that the orphanage needed hands, any hands. Inside, she found rooms filled with quiet eyes, dozens of children, barefoot, underfed, whispering in languages that mixed together like ghosts of the war. Some were German, some were Polish. and some had faces that made the neighbors avert their gaze. Brown eyes, darker skin, unmistakably American fathers they would never meet. She knelt beside a small boy building a tower of stones. "What's your name?" she asked in German. He looked up shyly. "Carl," he said. Then, almost apologetically, added in English, "Daddy American." The words hit her like a gust of cold wind. For a long time, she couldn't answer. Then she smiled. "It's a good name," she said softly. Each day she returned. She cleaned, cooked, taught them songs. When the children grew restless, she told them stories about faraway oceans, about wheat fields where the wind never stopped, about how kindness could survive anything. But the nights were harder. The children screamed in their sleep, haunted by sirens they no longer heard. One evening, as she soothed a crying girl, Leisel whispered, "There's no more war, little one." The child looked up with tear-streaked cheeks and said, "Then why am I still scared?" Leisel had no answer. She only held her tighter. Weeks passed. One morning, American soldiers delivered food supplies. Among them was a chaplain who recognized her from the camp. "You stayed," he said. She nodded. "Someone has to teach them that mercy still exists." He smiled sadly. "Then maybe you've already won your war." That night, the children fell asleep to her humming, a soft tune she once heard through prison loudspeakers, back when freedom was only a rumor. And as she looked at their peaceful faces, she understood. The war had ended on maps, but inside these small broken hearts, it still raged quietly. What she didn't know yet was that peace, too, demands a kind of courage, the courage to forgive yourself. It was late November when he arrived. The orphanage yard was slick with rain, and the air smelled faintly of coal smoke and wet earth. Leisel was fixing a broken window when she heard the knock, a slow, deliberate rhythm that carried a weight she couldn't name. The man at the door wore a tattered overcoat, his hat pulled low. He was thin, his eyes sharp yet hollow, like someone who'd spent too long trying not to remember. "I heard you need help," he said quietly. His German was clipped, military precise. "Carpentry, repairs, I can work." Leisel hesitated. "Have we met?" He looked away. "Once. Camp Leavenworth. I was a guard." The world tilted. For a moment she couldn't breathe. Images flooded back, the fences, the floodlights, the taste of ash in the wind. He kept his head down. "I know who you are. You helped an American soldier once. I was the one who called you back behind the wire." Silence stretched between them like a fault line. Finally, she said, "Why are you here?" He swallowed hard. "Because the war didn't end for me either." That night he worked quietly, fixing the door hinges, mending broken chairs. When the children had gone to sleep, he came to her holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a rusted badge, an eagle, wings outstretched, gripping a swastika. He set it on the table. "I can't carry it anymore," he whispered. "I told myself I was just following orders. But I remember the prisoners who begged for water. I remember doing nothing." His voice cracked. "Tell me how you learned to forgive." Leisel stared at the badge, its surface dull under the lamplight. "I didn't," she said softly. "I just stopped hating. It's not the same thing." He nodded, tears gathering in his eyes. "Then maybe that's enough." As he left, she took the badge and buried it beneath the orphanage garden, where tulips would bloom in spring. The children would never know what slept under that soil. But she would. Because forgiveness, she realized, isn't granted in words. It's built slowly, like a house, brick by brick, act by act, until even the ghosts have somewhere gentle to rest. And when the first snow came that winter, it would bring something she never expected. A letter not from the past, but from the future she thought she'd never deserve. The snow came early that year, soft, silent, merciful. It blanketed the orphanage roof and muffled the echoes of the city. Leisel was ladling soup when the postman appeared at the door, his breath fogging in the cold. "For you," he said, handing her a single envelope with a blue seal in foreign handwriting. She didn't open it right away. She knew that script. It was careful, slanted, American. That night, after the children had fallen asleep, she sat by the fire and unfolded the paper. The first line stopped her breath. "Dear Leisel, I've thought of you every day since the camp. I'm alive because you refused to see an enemy when I was bleeding in the dirt." Her hands trembled. The words went on. "I've joined a veterans hospital in Boston. They're short on nurses, on translators, on people who understand both sides of what happened. I remember how you cared for the children in Berlin. I think America could use that kind of mercy too." Inside the envelope was a travel document, official and stamped, a visa, and beneath it a small photograph, James Carter, standing in front of a red brick building by the sea, smiling like someone who'd finally made peace with the past. For a long time she couldn't move. The crackle of the fire was the only sound in the room. She ran her fingers over the paper, over the faint smell of ocean salt still clinging to it. To leave Germany felt like betrayal. To stay felt like surrender. But for the first time, both choices meant life. She walked to the window. Snowflakes drifted down through the streetlight glow. The world outside was quiet, as if waiting for her answer. She whispered into the glass, "Maybe forgiveness isn't a place we reach. Maybe it's the road itself." Then she folded the letter, pressed it to her heart, and began to pack her things. Because the war had taken everything from her. But this letter had given her something rarer. A beginning. And as dawn broke over a white Berlin, she took her first step toward it. The ship left Bremerhaven beneath a gray December sky. The deck was crowded with silence, faces pressed against railings, hands clutching small bundles of everything that remained of their lives. For many, this was escape. For Leisel, it was something harder to name. As the shoreline dissolved into mist, she watched the gulls follow the ship for miles before turning back toward a country she no longer belonged to. The cold wind stung her eyes, but she didn't cry. She had no tears left for what was behind her, only awe for the unknown ahead. Weeks later, she saw it. The skyline rising from the horizon like a promise. New York. The city looked unreal. Towers of glass and light shimmering against the dawn, smoke curling from ships in the harbor. People around her gasped and clutched their rosaries, but Leisel only whispered, "So this is where mercy lives." When she stepped onto American soil, a young customs officer smiled and said, "Welcome home." Home. The word echoed in her chest, strange and beautiful. Boston was colder, quieter. The Veterans Hospital stood on a hill overlooking the harbor, red brick walls bright against the snow. Inside, the smell of antiseptic and coffee filled the halls. James met her there, older but unchanged in the eyes. He handed her a nurse's badge and said, "We could use someone who understands both sides of pain." She worked long hours, washing wounds, taking notes, reading letters aloud to men who could no longer write. Some had fought in the same war that destroyed her country. None looked at her with hatred. At night, when she left the ward, she would stand by the window and watch the ships in the bay. Somewhere across that water lay the ghosts of everything she had been. But here, in this country once called the enemy, she found something that felt closer to redemption than any prayer she had ever spoken. And sometimes, when the wind from the Atlantic carried the faint smell of bacon and coffee through the hospital kitchen, she smiled, because mercy, she finally knew, was not weakness. It was survival. Yet even as she began to build a new life, history was not done with her. The past, like the tide, always finds a way back. It was 10 years later when the knock came again. By then, Leisel had grown used to quiet mornings, the clatter of breakfast trays, the distant whistle of trains beyond the harbor, the soft hum of a hospital finding rhythm in peace. But that knock, it carried history. A man in a gray coat stood at her door, holding a notebook and a recorder. His accent was American, but his eyes carried the curiosity of someone who'd read too many untold stories. "Miss Miller," he said, "I'm a journalist. I'm writing a book about the German prisoners who lived in U.S. camps during the war. Someone told me you were one of them." Her hand froze on the doorknob. She hadn't spoken that truth aloud in years. "Why?" she asked. "Because people don't believe it," he replied. "They don't believe the enemy was treated with kindness. They think it's propaganda." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. They sat by the window overlooking the harbor. The journalist turned on his recorder, its reels spinning softly. "Do you remember the first thing you saw when you arrived in America?" She smiled faintly. "Bacon and eggs," she said. He laughed, surprised. "That's it?" "That," she said, "was the first thing that told me everything I'd been taught was wrong." As she spoke, the memories unfolded again. The showers, the white bread, the library, the music on the 4th of July. Her voice trembled but did not break. "They fed us, educated us, even trusted us," she said. "And that trust changed us more than any punishment could have." When the interview ended, the journalist stood and shook her hand. "I think people need to hear this," he said quietly. "Not as history, but as proof." After he left, she sat alone watching the tide roll in. The recorder's hum still echoed in her mind. Proof. That word lingered like a prayer. She realized that survival wasn't just about living through something terrible, it was about speaking of it, so it couldn't be twisted or erased. That night, she wrote a single sentence in her notebook. "Mercy is the memory the world forgets the fastest." And she decided she would not let it be forgotten again, because even peace, left untold, can disappear. The article was published in the spring of 1956. It appeared in a Boston newspaper first, 3 pages, black ink on white paper, under a quiet title, "Mercy Behind the Wire, The Untold Story of German POWs in America." Leisel never expected anyone to read it. She was wrong. Within days, letters flooded the paper's office, from veterans, from widows, from Germans scattered across both sides of a divided Europe. Some thanked her for reminding them that kindness could exist even in war. Others accused her of betrayal, of romanticizing the enemy, of rewriting the past. The noise grew. American radio hosts debated it. German newspapers reprinted it with sharp headlines. "A woman who forgot her country." Reporters camped outside her small apartment. Neighbors whispered. The hospital board asked her to take a leave of absence until things quiet down. For a week, she stayed inside, blinds drawn, the world outside pounding with questions she wasn't ready to answer. But one afternoon, a group of her former patients came to her door. Men who had once been soldiers, now fathers and grandfathers. One of them, missing a leg, handed her a folded clipping of the article. "You told the truth," he said simply, "and that's harder than fighting any war." That night, Leisel stood before a small community hall. The seats were filled, some curious, some angry, all waiting. The microphone hissed softly. She looked down at her trembling hands, then began to speak. "I was a prisoner once," she said, "but not because of barbed wire, because of belief. I believed mercy was weakness. I believed compassion made nations fall. But America proved me wrong. They fought with power, but they conquered with kindness." The room was silent. Then slowly, one person began to clap. Another followed. And then the sound filled the hall, not like applause, but like forgiveness taking form. She didn't speak again that night. She didn't have to. The next morning, the newspaper printed a second headline. Former POW speaks of mercy, crowd moved to tears. And for the first time since the war, she felt something she hadn't known she was missing. Not vindication, not fame, peace. But her story wasn't over yet, because history, like mercy, needs a witness until its very last breath. Kansas, 50 years later. The wind swept across the prairie like an old memory, gentle, endless, unchanging. Where the camp once stood, there was only a quiet field now. The watchtowers were gone, the barracks replaced by wheat and silence. Leisel stood at the edge of it all, a cane in one hand, a candle in the other. Her hair was silver, her eyes still sharp, the same gray that had once watched a world burn and rebuild itself. Beside her, a small group of students waited, notebooks ready. They had come to film a documentary, Voices of the Forgotten. One asked softly, "Is this really where it happened?" She nodded. "Yes, right here. We thought we were walking into punishment. Instead, we found something far more dangerous." "What was that?" the student asked. "Understanding." She walked slowly into the field. The wheat whispered against her skirt as she knelt and placed the candle in the dirt. From her pocket, she pulled a faded scrap of paper, her old note from the camp, the one that had survived ships, borders, wars, and years. The ink had nearly vanished, but the words still breathed. "They feed us like family. Maybe they have won not because of power, but because of plenty." Her voice broke as she read it aloud. "I wrote this when I was 20. I didn't know then what mercy really meant. It's not the opposite of justice. It's what keeps justice human." The sun was setting now, casting long golden shadows across the field. The students watched her in silence, the camera forgotten. She turned to them and smiled. "You live in a world I never imagined, one where you can read, question, travel freely. Don't waste that. Freedom isn't inherited. It's practiced." A gust of wind blew out the candle's flame, but she didn't relight it. She simply whispered, "They came as soldiers. They left as witnesses." Then she looked at the horizon, where the light met the land, where the war had ended but its lessons still lingered, and whispered one last truth. Mercy is the only victory time cannot erase. The camera stayed rolling long after she turned away, her figure small against the vast glowing plain, and somewhere, carried on the wind, a familiar sound returned, the faint crackle of an old radio playing Glenn Miller's "Don't Fence Me In," the same song that had once echoed over barbed wire. Now it drifted free.